General Adolf Galland stood in the operations room of Luftwaffe High Command, staring at a radar plot that should not exist. The tracking data showed American fighters, single-engine, long-range escorts, operating directly over Berlin. The range from their English bases, 850 kilometers. Every calculation, every intelligence estimate, every strategic assumption about Allied fighter capabilities had just been invalidated by a single mission. Galland was 42 years old, a veteran fighter ace now serving as Inspector General of Fighters. He had spent 3 years building Germany's air defense network on one core promise, that enemy bombers, if they reached the Reich, would do so alone. German interceptors would tear them apart without opposition. That promise died the moment P-51 Mustangs appeared over the capital. The reports came in waves. Pilots from Jagdgeschwader 1 and 11 described sleek, fast American fighters engaging them at altitudes above 25,000 feet and staying with them through every maneuver. One pilot's combat report noted the Mustang's distinctive profile: bubble canopy, laminar flow wing, belly radiator scoop. These weren't the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts German pilots knew. These were something new, and they had enough fuel to hunt. Galland pulled the mission logs. March 6, 1944, the first recorded engagement over Berlin. American heavy bombers struck targets in the city's industrial suburbs, but this time they arrived with fighter escort all the way to the target and all the way home. German interception rates dropped by more than half. Losses among the bombers fell accordingly. Losses among the Luftwaffe fighters climbed. The tactical implications were immediate and catastrophic. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had relied on a simple equation: find the bomber stream, position fighters ahead of it, attack before they reach the target. The bombers were slow, heavily loaded, vulnerable. But now every intercept meant facing enemy fighters with speed, range, and numbers. German pilots had to fight their way to the bombers and fight their way out. Galland requested confirmation from multiple fighter wings. The answers were unanimous. The new American fighters could engage over Berlin, remain on station for 15 to 20 minutes, and still return to England. He later wrote in his memoir that the reports felt surreal, like being told the laws of physics had changed. But the numbers were undeniable. The P-51 Mustang, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with drop tanks, had an operational radius exceeding 1,000 kilometers. It could escort bombers to any target in Germany. There was no sanctuary left. The strategic collapse was instant. If Berlin could be reached by enemy fighters, so could Munich, Hamburg, Stuttgart, the Ruhr factories, the oil refineries, the aircraft production plants. Every critical installation in the Reich was now exposed in daylight. The Luftwaffe's defensive line, stretched thin across Western Europe, had just become meaningless. Galland knew what this meant. The air war wasn't about tactics anymore. It was about mathematics. The Americans could now guarantee fighter cover over every raid. They could replace losses faster than Germany could train pilots. They could fly daily missions while the Luftwaffe rationed fuel. The equation was simple, and it was final. Galland was summoned to brief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring demanded an explanation. Galland provided the radar data, the pilot reports, the fuel calculations. Göring dismissed them. He accused his own commanders of defeatism. He insisted the reports were exaggerated, that German pilots were simply losing their nerve. But the missions continued. March 8th, Mustangs over Berlin again. March 9th, deeper penetration, longer engagement times. March 11th, American fighters strafing airfields on the return leg, destroying German aircraft on the ground. The pattern was now clear. The Mustang wasn't just escorting bombers, it was hunting the Luftwaffe into extinction. One staff officer recorded in his diary, "We have seen the future, and it is American." Galland prepared his report for Hitler. He had to explain how the Reich's air defenses, built at enormous cost, staffed by Germany's best pilots, equipped with advanced radar and cannon-armed interceptors, had just become obsolete. The Americans had solved the one problem Germany thought was unsolvable: how to put a fighter over Berlin and bring it home. The war in the air had entered a new phase, and Germany had already lost it. The killing started in earnest. German fighter units that had spent years perfecting interception tactics against heavy bombers now faced an enemy that could fight back at their own altitude, at their own speed. The Bf-109s and FW-190s, designed to slash through bomber formations and escape before escort fighters could react, suddenly had nowhere to run. Galland's daily loss reports told the story in brutal arithmetic. Luftwaffe fighter losses over the Reich averaged 43 aircraft per day during major operations. Pilot casualties ran even higher. Experienced flight leaders, squadron commanders, men with hundreds of combat hours were being shot down by American pilots with a fraction of their experience. The Mustang's advantages were simple but decisive. It was faster in level flight, it could outturn the Bf-109 at high altitude, and it had 650 caliber machine guns that could shred a German fighter in a 2-second burst. One group of commander from Jagdgeschwader 3 filed a report after a mission near Brunswick. His unit launched 24 fighters to intercept a bomber formation. They were engaged by Mustangs before reaching the bombers. Within 7 minutes, 11 German aircraft were destroyed. 4 pilots were killed. The survivors never fired a shot at a bomber. The tactical doctrine that had governed German air defense since 1942 disintegrated. Previously, interceptors could approach bomber streams from ahead or below, concentrate their fire, and break away before the slower P-47 escorts could intervene. Now, Mustangs flew high cover above the bombers and dove on German formations during their attack runs. The Americans had speed, altitude, and position. German pilots had to fight through them just to reach their targets, and fight through them again to escape. What had been a dangerous job became a death sentence. Pilot losses exceeded 25% per month in some fighter wings. Entire Staffeln, 9 to 12 aircraft, were wiped out in single engagements. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer than 150 flight hours, sometimes less. They died on their first or second missions, shot down by Americans with better training, better tactics, and better aircraft. Hermann Göring refused to accept reality. At a conference, he accused Galland and other senior commanders of spreading defeatist propaganda. He insisted the Mustang's capabilities were being exaggerated. When presented with combat film and loss statistics, Göring blamed pilot morale. He issued orders demanding more aggressive attacks, larger formations, closer engagement with bombers. The orders were operationally meaningless. The Luftwaffe couldn't lose pilots any faster and still function. But the collapse wasn't just measured in aircraft and men. The Americans understood exactly what the P-51 had unlocked: the ability to destroy German aircraft production at its source. Bomber formations, now escorted all the way to target and back, began systematically hitting factories that built the very fighters sent to stop them. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, watched the industrial damage mount with alarm. American raids struck Fu-190 assembly plants in Bremen and Oschersleben. Bombers hit Bf-109 production facilities in Regensburg and Augsburg. Speer's ministry recorded an immediate production drop. Planned fighter output fell short by more than 400 aircraft. Projections looked worse. The Luftwaffe was being trapped in a lethal spiral. Losses demanded more fighters. But the factories that built fighters were being destroyed because the Luftwaffe couldn't stop the bombers anymore, and it couldn't stop the bombers because American fighters now ruled the sky over Germany. Galland met with his operational staff. They ran the numbers. Current pilot losses, approximately 400 per month. Current training output, 250 replacement pilots per month. The math was inescapable. By summer, the Luftwaffe would have aircraft but not enough trained men to fly them. By autumn, it wouldn't have either. One intelligence officer summarized the situation in a memo to high command. The enemy has achieved what we thought impossible: fighter dominance over the Reich itself. Our defensive system is no longer viable. The American raids continued daily. Mustangs appeared over every major target: Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, Munich, the Ruhr industrial complex. They didn't just escort bombers, they strafed airfields on the return leg, destroying German aircraft before they could even take off. They shot up trains, trucks, fuel depots. They owned German airspace in daylight, and the calendar was moving toward a date every German general knew was coming: the Allied invasion of France. When it came, the Luftwaffe would be needed over the beaches, over the ports, over the roads where German reinforcements would move. But the fighter force was being bled white over Germany, defending cities and factories it could no longer protect. The mathematics had spoken. Losses exceeded replacements. The Luftwaffe was shrinking, and the men who led it knew exactly why. The Mustang had turned air defense into a war of attrition, and Germany was losing. The conference room at Karrenhall, Göring's palatial estate north of Berlin, had witnessed 3 years of Luftwaffe strategy meetings. The session in early May 1944 marked the point where strategy gave way to fantasy. Galland arrived with charts, loss reports, and a proposal born of desperation. He recommended concentrating all available day fighters into massive formations of 300 to 400 aircraft, enough mass to break through American escort screens and savage the bomber streams. The cost would be severe. Entire regions of Germany would be left undefended. Industrial targets in those areas would be destroyed without opposition. But it was the only way to inflict losses heavy enough to make the Americans reconsider daylight operations. Göring rejected the plan outright. He demanded the Luftwaffe defend everything, everywhere, all the time. He ordered offensive sweeps against Allied airfields in England, missions that would require fighters to carry extra fuel, reducing their combat capability, and operate over enemy territory where losses would be total. When Galland explained the fuel reserves didn't exist for such operations, Göring accused him of cowardice. The Reichsmarschall had gained weight, his uniforms now garishly decorated with medals that no longer meant anything. He spent more time managing his art collection than managing the air war, but he still wielded absolute authority over Luftwaffe operations, and he refused to acknowledge what his own pilots were reporting from the cockpit, that the air war was lost. Galland's staff had already done the calculations. A post-war Allied interrogation uncovered their internal assessment. At current loss rates, the Luftwaffe would cease to function as an effective defensive force by November. Pilot quality was collapsing faster than aircraft numbers. New pilots arriving at operational units had less than one-third the training hours of their predecessors a year earlier. They were being thrown into combat against American pilots who had survived dozens of missions, who flew better aircraft, and who hunted in coordinated packs. The Americans weren't just winning, they were systematizing German destruction. Mustang groups adopted tactics specifically designed to shred Luftwaffe formations. High-cover fighters would bounce German interceptors from above, while low-cover fighters protected the bombers. If German fighters tried to disengage, the Mustangs pursued them back to their own airfields and shot them down during landing approach. One American fighter group claimed 17 German aircraft destroyed in a single mission, most of them killed while trying to land with empty fuel tanks and jammed guns. German ground commanders watched the air battle with growing dread. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now responsible for defending France against the inevitable Allied invasion, sent urgent requests for air support guarantees. He needed the Luftwaffe to contest the invasion beaches, to disrupt landing craft, to attack supply lines. He received no assurances. Rommel wrote to his wife, "The enemy's air superiority is crushing. I cannot see how we can win." General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff for Army Group West, testified that German commanders in France understood they would fight the invasion without meaningful air cover. The Luftwaffe was being consumed over Germany itself, unable to spare fighters for operations elsewhere. Plans that assumed German air superiority or even parity were rewritten to assume none at all. The split between Göring and his operational commanders became unbridgeable. Galland proposed another alternative: withdraw fighters from the Eastern Front, where the Soviets had already achieved air dominance, and mass them in the West. Göring refused. He insisted on maintaining token forces everywhere, achieving nothing anywhere. When Galland pressed the issue, Göring threatened him with dismissal. Meanwhile, the Mustangs flew daily. They escorted bombers to synthetic oil plants in Silesia, ball-bearing works in Schweinfurt, aircraft factories in Leipzig. They strafed locomotives, barges, airfields, and anything else that moved. One German railway official recorded that daylight train traffic in Western Germany had become suicidal. American fighters attacked anything on the tracks. The Luftwaffe's remaining experienced pilots understood the trajectory. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, stated, "We knew we were simply delaying the inevitable. The question wasn't whether we would lose air superiority. We had already lost it. The question was how long we could survive." Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. The very oil refineries the Luftwaffe was supposed to protect were being destroyed. Training flights were curtailed. Operational sorties were rationed. Some fighter units were grounded entirely, waiting for fuel deliveries that never came. The Mustangs, meanwhile, flew multiple missions per day, and the calendar moved toward June. Intelligence reports confirmed Allied invasion preparations across southern England. Landing craft, supply dumps, troop concentrations. The attack could come any day. Rommel's armies would face it alone under open skies, while the Luftwaffe burned over Germany. Galland submitted one final report to Göring. It contained a single recommendation: inform Hitler that the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee air superiority over any battlefield, including an invasion front. Göring filed the report away and said nothing. The last illusion had been that German air power might still matter when the Allies came ashore. That illusion died before the first landing craft hit the beach. June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion fleet struck the Normandy coast at dawn. Over 150,000 troops came ashore across 5 beaches. Naval guns hammered German defensive positions, and above it all, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties over the invasion beaches during the first 24 hours. The Allies flew more than 14,000. German pilots who did reach Normandy described a sky so crowded with enemy aircraft they couldn't find openings to attack. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, transport aircraft, all moving freely, unmolested, directing the battle below. Oberst Josef Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, led one of the few German attacks that morning. He and his wingman strafed Sword Beach in a single high-speed pass, firing into the landing craft and troops. Then they ran for their lives, pursued by British Spitfires. It was the only Luftwaffe action most invasion troops ever saw. Priller described the mission as a gesture of defiance, militarily meaningless. At German headquarters in France, the requests for air support began arriving within hours of the landings. Army commanders reported Allied aircraft circling over every road, every troop movement, every attempt to bring reinforcements forward. The replies from Luftwaffe liaison officers were uniform: no aircraft available. The fighters were over Germany, defending against yet another American bomber raid. They couldn't be spared. General Gunther Blumentritt stood at his headquarters window that afternoon and watched Allied bombers strike German positions just kilometers away. He testified, "The sky was filled with enemy aircraft like a plague of locusts. I did not see a single German plane, not one." The absence of German air power wasn't an accident. It was the mathematical conclusion of 3 months of attrition over the Reich. The P-51 Mustang had forced the Luftwaffe into an impossible choice: defend Germany or defend France. Göring had chosen Germany. The fighter units that might have contested Normandy were locked in a death spiral over Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr, bleeding out against American escorts they couldn't defeat. Field Marshal Rommel's worst predictions materialized on the ground. The 12th SS Panzer Division attempted to counterattack toward the beaches. Allied fighter bombers caught the columns on the roads north of Caen. Rocket-armed Typhoons and bomb-laden Thunderbolts struck in waves. The division lost 40% of its armor before it reached the front. Survivors reported they couldn't move in daylight. Every vehicle that appeared on a road drew immediate air attack. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned closest to the invasion beaches, tried to push British forces back into the sea. The attack stalled when Allied naval gunfire and airstrikes destroyed the lead elements. The division commander stated, "We were fighting the entire Allied Air Force with no support from our own. It was hopeless." German reinforcements crawled toward Normandy under cover of darkness. A journey that should have taken 1 day required 3. Panzer Lehr Division, moving from positions southeast of Paris, took 5 days to reach the front, a distance of 150 kilometers. Allied aircraft destroyed its fuel trucks, its supply columns, its reconnaissance elements. The division arrived under strength and without adequate ammunition. What air support the Luftwaffe did provide came at catastrophic cost. German pilots flew low-level attack missions against invasion shipping and beachheads with almost no chance of survival. Some units lost 50% of their aircraft in a single mission. The sorties accomplished nothing. The invasion proceeded exactly as Allied planners had designed. The strategic trap was now fully sprung. The Luftwaffe, designed to protect Germany and support German armies, could do neither. The Mustangs and their Allied counterparts had forced German fighters into a defensive war over the Reich itself, a war the Luftwaffe was losing. Meanwhile, the armies in France fought without the air support that German doctrine assumed would always be available. Hitler demanded explanations. Why was the Luftwaffe absent from the decisive battle? Göring blamed weather, fuel shortages, pilot cowardice, anything but the truth. The truth was that the P-51 Mustang, by making every target in Germany vulnerable to daylight attack, had pinned the Luftwaffe in place. German fighters couldn't abandon the Reich's cities and factories to defend Normandy, but staying over Germany meant dying over Germany. The mathematics were undeniable. The Allies had landed 500,000 troops in France. They controlled the air completely. German counterattacks failed not because of Allied ground strength, but because German armor couldn't reach the battlefield intact. Rommel sent a message to Hitler's headquarters. Without air superiority, the Normandy front could not be held. One staff officer wrote in his diary, "Our soldiers fight bravely, but they are fighting blind. The enemy sees everything. We see nothing. How can we win?" The Normandy lodgment became unbreakable. Allied forces had air superiority, supply superiority, and freedom of movement. German forces had none of it. The Luftwaffe continued fighting over Germany, losing pilots, losing aircraft, losing the war. And in France, the German army learned what warfare looked like when the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. The day the Luftwaffe disappeared from the battlefield was the day Germany lost any chance of throwing the Allies back into the sea. The P-51 hadn't just escorted bombers to Berlin, it had guaranteed the invasion would succeed. The institutional collapse came quietly in the minds of men who could no longer pretend. By summer 1944, every German general with operational responsibility understood the war's outcome. They had lost control of the sky. Everything that followed was consequence. Galland, in his post-war interrogation by Allied intelligence officers, stated the conclusion with brutal clarity. The day we saw single-engine American fighters over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was simply a matter of time. The P-51 hadn't just achieved tactical superiority, it had exposed the fundamental weakness in Germany's strategic position. The Reich could not protect its cities, its factories, or its armies from an enemy that commanded the air. The Luftwaffe continued to exist through the final year of the war, but it existed as a shadow. Pilot training, once a rigorous 12-month program, was cut to 10 weeks by autumn. New pilots arrived at operational units with barely enough hours to take off and land safely. They were shot down on their first missions by American pilots who had been flying combat for a year or more. The kill ratios became grotesque. Experienced Allied pilots racked up 5, 10, 15 victories in single sorties against formations of German novices. Fuel rationing made the crisis worse. Germany's synthetic oil plants, targeted relentlessly by American bombers escorted by Mustangs, operated at a fraction of capacity. By October, aviation fuel production had dropped 90% from its peak. Fighter units sat grounded for days, waiting for enough fuel to fly a single mission. When they did fly, they often lacked the fuel for prolonged combat. Pilots were forced to disengage or attempt emergency landings with empty tanks. The final irony was technological. Germany produced the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than any Allied aircraft, capable of 540 miles per hour, fast enough to slash through bomber formations and escape before Mustangs could react. On paper, it could have changed the air war. In practice, it changed nothing. The Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its speed advantage disappeared. Allied pilots, particularly Mustang groups, identified the jet bases and waited. They orbited above the airfields and dove on jets as they climbed through 1,000 feet, still accelerating, or as they descended to land with fuel exhausted. German jet pilots described the tactic as murder. Some of Germany's most experienced pilots died in jets that never had a chance to fight. Even when Me-262s reached altitude and engaged bombers, the results were limited. Fuel restrictions meant jets could operate for 20 to 30 minutes before returning to base, where Mustangs waited. Pilot training was inadequate. Most jet pilots had fewer than 10 hours in type before combat, and there were never enough of them. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Me-262s. Only a fraction became operational. Allied air superiority prevented mass deployment. The Americans flew with impunity. Mustang pilots strafed German trains in broad daylight, destroyed supply trucks on highways, shot up airfields, and destroyed aircraft on the ground. Some pilots claimed more victories from strafing runs than from air combat. Germany's transportation network disintegrated. Moving troops or supplies in daylight became suicidal. General Blumentritt, reflecting on the final year of the war, stated, "We were paralyzed. Every movement was observed from the air. Every concentration of forces was bombed. We could not maneuver, could not reinforce, could not retreat without suffering massive casualties. The enemy owned the sky and we were helpless beneath it." By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to matter. The remaining pilots flew sporadic missions with inadequate fuel, inadequate training, and inadequate numbers. The airfields were under constant attack. The factories that built aircraft were rubble. The oil that powered them no longer existed. Germany's armies fought on, but they fought blind, under skies crowded with enemy aircraft that struck at will. One staff officer's diary, recovered after the war, captured the emotion beneath the operational collapse. The entry read simply, "We are naked now. The Americans fly wherever they wish. We cannot stop them. We can barely see them. This is what defeat looks like." Adolf Galland was relieved of his command in January 1945 after repeated clashes with Göring. He formed a jet fighter unit, Jagdverband 44, and flew combat missions until the final weeks of the war. It was a gesture, nothing more. The outcome had been decided months earlier, when American fighters appeared over Berlin and Germany had no answer. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Its cities were ash. Its armies were encircled or destroyed. Its air force no longer existed as a fighting force. The Allies had flown more than 2.7 million sorties over Europe. The Luftwaffe at its peak had fielded 5,000 fighters. By war's end, it had fewer than 200 operational aircraft. Surviving Luftwaffe commanders, interviewed in Allied prisoner of war camps, returned again and again to the same moment, March 1944, when long-range American fighters first appeared over the Reich. That was the moment they knew. Some admitted it immediately. Others took months to accept it, but all of them eventually understood that the P-51 Mustang over Berlin was not just a tactical development, it was the visible proof that Germany had lost the industrial war, the technological war, and the strategic war for control of the air. And in total war, losing the air meant losing everything.